Hello, I'm Troy Sangarone, Senior Director and Fellow at the Korea Economic Institute. I'm joined today by Randall Jones, a non-resident Distinguished Fellow here at KAI, and previously the Senior Counselor for East Asia and the head of the Japan-Korea desk at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Randall worked with his former colleagues at the OECD on the recent economic survey of Korea and wrote the chapter on youth employment. Youth employment has been a pressing issue in Korea over multiple administrations that has implications not just for the economy, but for demographics and society as a whole. We are delighted to have Randall here today with us to discuss this important issue. If you have not read the OECD's paper and Randall's analysis of the issues related to youth employment, I would commend the paper to you. And also, I would encourage you to take and ask questions today. We will be setting aside time at the end, and for those watching at home, please use the chat function. Randall, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. It's very nice to be here in person. I think this is the first time since I was at OECD I've actually come here to make a presentation, so it's very nice to be here. As you mentioned, the Korean government asked that we have a chapter on youth employment, which shows what a key issue that really is. And so today,
that's the down button is actually forward. Yeah, sorry. Counterintuitive.
The main points I'd like to make, first of all, is that the unemployment rate in Korea for young people is relatively low, and that's a concern because Korea's population is already shrinking, and so they'll have a labor shortage as Japan and some other countries. Second, while the unemployment rate for men has fallen for all categories of youth, for women it's actually been going up, which is an interesting phenomenon. I'll talk a bit about that as well. The key factor explaining low youth employment is that there's a mismatch between what education prepares students for and what the labor market and companies are asking for. So we have this shortage of workers in the SMEs and too many university graduates who don't want to work in SMEs. So there's this mismatch problem. It also goes back to the issue of having labor market dualism, where you have non-regular workers and regular workers, and the difference in wages and job security make it so that people want to be regular workers, and they'll stay in school and try to get that to happen. And finally, there's a huge gap between large firms and small firms in terms of productivity and wages, which again makes it difficult for small firms to get workers. So the fundamental point is that to address this issue of low youth employment, we have to go to the root of the problem, which is the mismatch between education and labor, the dualism in the labor market, and the dualism in the product market. So today I'd briefly like to talk about these points, starting with the trends in youth employment. So this is just looking at all 38 OECD countries, looking at employment rates for the 15 to 29 age group. So Korea is at 44%, where they were in 2020. OECD average is 53%. So Korea stands out with low female employment and also low youth employment. So that's two problems. So today I'll just talk about the youth.
Yeah.
Another time we'll talk about...
That's a whole nother...
whole nother lecture
yes.
at the top. And so if we look over time, the youth employment rate in red has stayed between 40-45%, while for all ages, 15 and above, is closer to 60%. So the question is, how can we bring this rate up to address labor shortages in Korea? Well, if you look at the over time, what's happened to the youth population is steadily falling 21% over the past 21 years. And employment has been falling along with that. The small sliver in between is unemployment, but we don't really focus on unemployment so much. It's really the employment figure that we work on. So the problem for Korea is the demographics are very bleak. The birth rate is down to 0.8. Population peaked in 2020. By 2060, as you can see, it'll be down to 42 million, 18% drop.
As you're saying, the working age population has already started to decline
right.
too.
That's falling as well. 15 to 64 is also dropping. And then you look at the elderly, the red line, that population is going to double, 8 million to 16 million. And so by the time we get to 2060, the elderly share will be up to 43% of the population. Essentially, one person retired for every 2 people working, which makes it very hard for the working age population. So if we look at by gender, this shows men on the left and women on the right. For men, there's been an amazing decline over the past 20 years. For the red line, that's 25 to 29, it's fallen by 12 percentage points. For 20 to 24, the blue line, it's fallen by about 10 points. For the young women, on the other hand, we see an increase for all except the 20 to 24. So it's gone up by 15 percentage points for women. So we see this stark difference between men and women. So to try to explain that, first of all, for young men, many have been working in production, in the manufacturing sector. So the number of jobs in manufacturing, this dark black line, it fell by more than half, from 600,000 to 300,000. So there's less job opportunities for men as Korea's manufacturing sector starts to diminish. Now for young women, the share in professional and managerial jobs has shot up. That's the blue dotted line. So they've gone from 400,000 to 550,000. So the structural change in the economy is favoring female employment. So why are women getting these managerial jobs? Well, if you look at the share of people graduating from university, the rate for women is now about 10 points higher than for men. That's true in many countries, I think in the US as well. So this extra education for women is helping them to get more of these managerial jobs. The other thing is we see demographic changes. The average age of marriage has risen from less than 25 for women in 1990 to more than 30, almost 31. So in the past, women tended to leave the labor force when they got married or when they're expecting a baby. But since they pushed that off, more women in their 20s stay in the labor force. And that also means the age of the first birth is almost up to 33. So women are having fewer babies, but also later, and spending more time in the labor force. So the government has focused a great deal on the on youth employment. Every president, going back to Roh Moo-hyun, Im Young-bak, Park Geun-hye, and Moon Jae-in, have started these large programs to try to increase youth employment. And what do these packages have? Well, they have financial incentives to boost demand. So if an SME hires a young person, they get a tax break or a subsidy. And then on the supply side, they give funds to young people to make it better to work. So they can get free transport, income tax exemption, cash benefits, and these in-work benefits called the Earned Income Tax Credit. So we're trying to make it better, more rewarding to take these jobs in SMEs. And we also have quotas. In the public sector, your government agencies are supposed to have 3% of their hiring for unemployed youth. So we have all these programs trying to shift employment towards young people. The real problem is, though, if companies only need a certain number of workers and you get them to shift to younger workers, what happens to the older workers? And in Korea, the older workers have a very high poverty rate. For people over 65, the poverty rate is 43%. So getting these people out of employment actually isn't the best thing to do either.
Yeah, and I mean, to me, it raises a structural issue too. And there's barriers to SMEs becoming larger firms. And so if you try to put in the younger workers, you have this challenge. So do you also need to then couple some of these reforms with, you know, basically market reforms to try and encourage SMEs to grow as well?
So when we talk about the dualism, why are SMEs so unproductive? Well, I have a long list of things that I could talk about. The first one would be they have trouble getting financing. So they have to go to the banks and use collateral, which means a house. They don't have very much R&D because they don't have money to spend on R&D. They have little innovation because they can't afford to buy the equipment and hire the workers who can use digital technology. And then the government gives very generous aid, perhaps the most generous among the OECD countries. So if you're an SME, what is the point of growing and graduating from SME status and losing special tax privileges, special subsidies? 43% of SMEs in Korea receive some type of government support. So we call this the Peter Pan syndrome. We don't want to grow up. Let's stay small. But when you stay small, you don't have gains in employment or productivity. So that is a key problem, this SME reluctance to grow. This is just to give you an idea that the new government, President Yoon, has a whole long list of ideas as well. So we'll continue to see many of these subsidies and programs that will try to encourage more youth. So I don't want to go, you can't read this, I can't read it from here either, but
I can read it, but it would take like 10 minutes to read through all of them. It's quite extensive.
Right. I'm just trying to show this is a priority, but my point today is that we don't really want to focus on small subsidies here and there. We need to focus on the fundamentals. What is causing low youth employment? So first of all, the president of KLI, Labor Institute, this is a government institute, in 2017 said there are over 200 job policies in place under different ministries and local authorities using an enormous budget without providing employment to or income solutions that are actually felt by young people. And he went on to say that we need to reduce the redundancy and inefficiency of these programs that are instituted in a haphazard fashion. So my point would be, let's don't worry about these 200 programs so much. Let's get down to the mismatch and the dualism issue. So, and this is really a social issue. This is a cartoon that I think it's from Chosun Ilbo, but in the press you often see this term, the Sampo Sede, the generation that gives up 3 things. Sometimes you talk about 8 things, and sometimes it's 6 things, but in this little cartoon, the 3 things in the bubble are love, and then kyoron, marriage, and childbirth. So this is a social issue, and it goes back to the demographic problem. The birth rate's 0.8, partly because the young generation thinks we can't afford to buy an apartment, to get married, and have children. So this is more than just economics. This is really a social issue.
And I mean, even that, it's a social issue, and then that has long-term national security implications as well. So I mean, it impacts all of society.
All right. There's one estimate that came out just last month. If the birth rate stays at 0.8, Korea's population by the end of the century will be less than 20 million. So that's where it was in 1949 before the Korean War. Yeah. So Korea would go from being this 10th largest economy to really a much smaller country in economy.
You look through the demographic data and you just think about the South Korean military, you know, now it's about 500,000 individuals. Right. There won't be enough young males in about 15 years or so to take and be able to do that, given where the birth rates are going. So it's a national security issue too.
Right. So now I'd like to just talk a bit about the education mismatch. And this is a sensitive subject because Korea has probably the greatest zeal and enthusiasm for education of almost any country in the world. So the problem is that we have young people trying to get high-level qualifications, university and graduate school, and then you have these older people retiring from jobs that don't need much human capital. So companies don't really want to replace this young SNU graduate who's replacing somebody 55 with a high school education. There's a mismatch there. So if you look at how many young people in Korea go to university, it's amazing. 3/4 are going from high school into tertiary, meaning either college or university. So it peaked at over 80% about the time of the global financial crisis. And this is what Lee Myung-bak said, we have an overeducation problem. And that was very jarring, especially to education specialists. Education is a good thing. How can we have too much of a good thing? That's like too much ice cream, or this is a good thing.
I just think it's too much ice cream as much as I don't want to admit that.
Right. So it came down by 2016. It was below 80, but now it's going back up. So we have a huge share of young people who want to go to college. If you look at the share of tertiary graduates among the 25-34, Korea ranks number 1, 70%. The U.S. is closer to 50%. So Korea stands out for the share of young people with tertiary education. So a former education minister, who worked for Lee Myung-bak, called it an education bubble. Kind of like we had property bubbles in certain countries. Korea is worried about an education bubble. So a government survey showed that 80% of teenagers want to go to a 4-year university, and their parents feel even more strongly. 90% want them to go to university. If we look at what's driving this is credentialism, the idea that an academic qualification is the best measure of an individual's intelligence or ability to perform a job. And this leads to education inflation. Job candidates need to obtain higher and higher degrees for positions that used to have lower requirements. For example, to be a hairdresser, in the past it was high school, and then it required a 2-year college degree in cosmetology. And now you need a 4-year university degree in cosmetology. So the level just keeps going up. to get a job.
And, I mean, we see that in the U.S. I know that there's jobs that, like, are in clerical positions and things where you have to have like a college degree, to where high school degrees would be completely sufficient for long-time work. And so we're seeing that in the U.S. too, this sort of credentialism.
Right. So it's hard to get out, because if you don't have this Sky University on your resume, you feel like a second-class citizen in many situations. So in Korea, 44.5% of graduates and 78.5% of graduate degree holders felt they're overqualified for their job. So they get the degree, they do something that used to be done by a high school graduate or someone with a junior college degree. And this undermines the value of work experience and diplomas, except from the most prestigious universities. And if we look at the university graduates' employment rate, it's surprising that for men, it's been dropping dramatically. So it's gone from more than 80% to under 70%. So more and more men are getting graduate degrees, but they have a harder time finding a job they want. So they have less chance of being employed than a high school graduate or a college graduate. For women, it's a bit different because of this demographic issue that's going on. So we also have, in addition to low employment, we have the question of NEETs. That stands for not in employment, education, or training. So it means people who finish their schooling and then they say, I don't like these jobs, or I can't find a job, so they go home and they wait for another job. I don't mean to imply they're doing nothing, because most are taking courses to try to qualify for the Samsung exam or a civil servant exam, or to get into a better college. So these people are busy doing informal education, but they've kind of dropped out of the education structure as they can't find what they want. So this is a serious problem, the question of NEETs. In most countries, the NEETs are mainly high school graduates. In Korea, 48% of these NEETs are tertiary graduates. So it's the high end of the education scale, are the people who aren't finding jobs and staying home. Now, the return to education in Korea is surprisingly low. Even though there's this fever for education, the return is very mediocre compared to the US or other OECD countries. $250,000 extra in lifetime earnings compared to a high school graduate.
Yeah, I find this really interesting, given that you do have a population that's highly educated in everything, and you've talked about mismatches in jobs and other things, but it also seems like maybe people aren't picking degrees that would work, but also companies aren't necessarily restructuring. So you have it kind of on both ends of the labor market too.
Exactly right, and mismatch on both sides. Exactly right. So the problems with the tertiary, this could be another long separate lecture, but just to summarize what the big problems are. First, gaining admission to top universities requires long years of preparation, and it requires hagwon for most kids. I met the mayor of Seoul, the former mayor, who'd come from a small town in, I think, Gyeongsang-namdo. And he was saying no one in his situation, in a small village with no hagwon, would ever be able to get to Seoul National University and get a prestigious job in Seoul. And so the problem is we have a lack of social mobility. During the post-war high-growth era, we had an expansion of secondary and primary school. That led to great social mobility. The children of farmers could go to the city and get a good job. But they had a survey in 2011, and these are academics and researchers, and those under the age of 40, 83% that admission to a prestigious school can be granted based on a personal skills and hard work, regardless of economic status. 83% disagreed with that, that you can get in regardless of status. So the social mobility is being limited by this education system.
Yeah, even if that's not accurate, just the fact that there's the perception that basically it's not possible is bad.
Right, discourages people from even trying. And this pressure to enter these universities is very bad for the well-being of children, because they're put under intense pressure to try to get into these universities. I know universities in Korea sometimes aren't as demanding, but I think after these kids go through that system for 12 years of high school and hagwon, I think they deserve a break.
That's really the college experience.
Right. That's what they need. That's good for them. And then the quality of Korean universities is rather low. The quality is ranked rather low in international comparison. And finally, they're not very sufficient, as you were mentioning earlier, is supplying the skills that business sector wants. So we have this mismatch. So let me just briefly show each of these. The hopes of upward mobility over time. what are the hopes that the next generation or your own generation will be better off than you are now? And so that is disappearing, and when that happens, people will give up their motivation to even try. In terms of life satisfaction, so the red bar shows the high satisfaction. So Korean youth, this is 15-year-olds, have the smallest share with high satisfaction, and the second highest share with low satisfaction. So this goes back to the Hagwon issue. If you've been in Korea when they give this CSAT, the college standardized admissions test, well, it's like a kind of a national holiday except for the children taking the test. Companies start later so kids can get to school on time. And during the English language comprehension test, airplanes are grounded because that might disrupt the hearing part of the exam. So this is an extremely tense, difficult day for young people. In terms of the skill sets that university graduates come out with, in Korea they are ranked relatively low, below the OECD average. So they get to college. At age 15, Korean students are the highest in terms of science, reading, math. But by the time they graduate from university, they're ranked below average.
Yeah, I think this is interesting too, because we often think about Korea as this highly educated population, and you talked about the quality of the universities, but they're not getting necessarily the skills that they need, and so it's kind of compounding the problem, if you will.
Right, exactly. And so we have this mismatch. 50% of students major in a field that they're not going to study or use in their career. I had a good friend who's a prominent economist, and he majored in chemical engineering. I said, why did you choose chemical engineering when you're interested in economics? He said, well, I wanted to get into Seoul National University, and there wasn't room in economics or law, so there was room here, so I chose that. So they get out, and their university education doesn't really help them in their career.
This seems like a long-term economic problem because, if students aren't getting into, one, the courses that businesses need, but two, that they're interested in, then not only do you have a skills mismatch, but the economy isn't producing the jobs. And so if we think about this going forward, technology is a major issue. On the slide before, earlier on the administration's policies, one of the things they want to do is identify talented individuals on tech early on. But if you don't have the school system set up to actually be able to funnel in the people with talent into those types of programs, you're not going to get the skills, which then has long-term innovation implications.
Exactly right. So we're going a bit deeper. Why do we have this lack of flexibility? Well, basically, here's one example first. Between 2010 and 2015, the students who graduate the computer science major in the United States, the number increased by 50%, while it actually fell in Korea. If we look at Stanford again, the engineering school, 43% of the students choose computer engineering compared to only 7% in SNU engineering school. And again, if we look at the number of computer science graduates at Stanford, it increased by fivefold between 2008 to 2020, and reaching 745 graduates, compared to a 27% increase in Seoul National to only 70 graduates. So as a result, we have a shortage of workers for ICT, information and communications technology. 0.4 million people, that's a huge shortage, and reflects this mismatch in the market. So why are universities doing this, and what can we do? The problem is that we have ceilings on enrollment in the universities in the Seoul metropolitan area, meaning Seoul metropolitan city, Incheon, and Gyeonggi province. And we don't have these ceilings outside of Seoul. And so the problem is that these universities in Seoul get a huge number of applicants, and they don't have to worry about attracting them to the high-tech fields that are demanded in the labor market. My friend went to Seoul National to do chemical engineering because there was a spot, not that he wanted to do Seoul chemical engineering.
So I'm just curious, why don't, the Seoul area schools really try to adjust things to have more people in the programs that are needed, but two, so I went to the University of Memphis, not Yale, Harvard, or anything for my undergraduate, but their archaeology program was one of the top in the countries, and so if you wanted to be an archaeologist, that's one of the schools you want to go to. It seems like in Korea that's not the case, to where the schools outside of Seoul are building up well-recognized programs, and people who are interested in that area go there.
Exactly. Because we have a problem where the number of college-age kids is going down sharply, and we have all these universities, many privately owned, that aren't highest quality. So if they want to survive, they're going to have to pick a specialty, like archaeology perhaps, and then they can try to maintain their position. So basically what I recommended in the survey was that we should not have ceilings on enrollment, and that would encourage the top universities in Seoul to compete by developing programs that will interest students who want to get a job in ICT or something else. So I think I've summarized this. I think I'll go on to the next slide. Well, the other problem with this is that it's very hard to change your major. So if you do get accepted to chemical engineering, you're stuck for 4 years. You can't really switch to the field you really want to go into. Okay. So we have a problem of the enrollment ceilings and then not being able to adapt in their field of major. So another issue is secondary, high school education. So Korea needs to get over the belief that the only path to success is to go to university, a top university, and get a regular job at a large corporation or the government. So we have to improve secondary schools so they can be a path that goes straight from school into the labor market. Over time, we've had too much of a focus on how to get into universities and not on job skills. So vocational high schools are becoming like general high schools. They're helping kids get into college or university rather than get into a good job. So rather than teaching these skills like creativity, critical thinking, collaboration, communication, they focus on what's on the CSAT, Korean, English, and math, rather than preparing them for jobs. So we need to allow students to get into university not only by the CSAT, but by the admission officer system, which actually started in 2008. And that's more of a broad-based system where you look at recommendations, essays, interviews, grades, outside activities. The problem is a lot of people don't like it because it's subjective. Mm-hmm. The current system is objective. You get a perfect score on the CSAT, you go to Seoul National. You miss 3, you go to Yonsei. This is very subjective, which makes people uncomfortable. But it's a better system for children. And we need more vocational high schools, which were originally aimed at giving skills so that you could actually go from high school into a job. So in Korea, the share of high school students in a vocational high school was 40% in '95. It's down to 18% in 2021. The OECD average is 44%. So we have a shift away from vocational high schools. So if you look at what is the path, vocational high school graduates, only 1/3 go to the labor market. The others go to higher education, mainly 2-year colleges or university. But still, we'd rather have that reversed where more are going into jobs. The government had an innovation back in 2008, I think, Meister schools, taken from Germany, where kids go to school half-time, high school, and then they have the afternoon to do an apprenticeship in a company. And then we also have an internship program where kids go to school in the morning, do an internship in the afternoon. And these are leading to 95% employment rates once they finish high school. The problem is these programs only cover 3% of high school graduates. And the problem isn't the supply side. The problem is not enough kids want to choose these Meister schools. So again, there's this commitment or idea that universities are the only path to success.
So interestingly, and I don't want to necessarily preempt your slide because I don't remember if you have one on this, but if I remember from the chapter, the return on value of education to vocational schools is actually much higher at the end of the day.
Right. On average, it's higher. There are people who get the golden ticket and get the very high salaries, but on average, you're better off going to a good vocational school and getting a job. But most people aren't looking to be slightly better than average. They want the golden ticket. Yeah. So it's very complicated. So why do they go to university rather than high school? Well, it's this golden ticket trying to avoid the SMEs and non-regular jobs. And so now, in the 2020 report by this Youth Policy Coordination Committee, chaired by the Prime Minister, he basically identified these challenges. The problem is the industrial structure, the dualistic structure of the labor market, such as regular jobs versus non-regular, and large enterprises versus small firm. So I'd briefly like to talk about what we should do. So non-regular workers are defined as fixed term, non-permanent, part-time, or atypical. That means on-call, contingent, dispatch, subcontracted. They're not regular workers. And so these people the share among young people has gone up to 42%. So that's a very high share of these young people. The problem is once you're branded as non-regular material, it's hard to get into the regular track. So a lot of kids, instead of taking non-regular jobs, they become NEETs, trying to become regular jobs, because there's a stigma if you come out as non-regular. And it's very unfair, because if you happen to graduate in 2008 during a global financial crisis, there's not jobs, so you might get branded just because bad timing, which is unfortunate.
Well, and as you could talk about any field, you often see people actually sometimes develop and peak later. So assuming that somebody who is in their late 20s, because they've had a couple irregular jobs, isn't a talented worker is maybe a bad assumption.
Exactly right. Some people bloom better than other people, so it's very unfair. So if we look at by age group, the share of non-regular is highest for young people, so women more than men, and then over 60, as people are forced by honorary retirement or mandatory retirement, they often become non-regular. So this is a problem that affects the youth particularly. So what's the problem with non-regular? Well, on average, they earn per hour 28% less. And there's no convincing evidence that this reflects their productivity or skills. It's just they're non-regular. And so it varies by category of non-regular, but overall, that's not a very good picture if you want to get married, have an apartment, have kids, and pursue a regular life. And they also receive less employment insurance, national health insurance, national pension system coverage, less bonus payments. That's a key thing in Korea. About a quarter of wage payments are bonus payments, and only 20% of non-regular get bonus payments. And then in terms of company pensions, they're very low, and they don't belong to unions. So the unions represent regular workers and not the regular workers who are the ones who need the support. So as you get a regular employment, your chance of ending up, if you get a high education, your chance of getting regular employment goes up. So for a four-year university, about 77% end up regular workers, and only about 70% are non-regular. If you're a high school graduate, 39% get regular, and then about 57% get non-regular. So if you stay and finish with high school, you have a big chance you're going to end up in the wrong category. So you want to keep going with education. So if you look at incomes by status, by education status, in the highest, the red category, there you have 60% of people with graduate degrees in the highest quartile, but only about 12% of those with high school degrees. And then in terms of the lowest quartile, 45% of high school graduates end up in the lowest income quartile. So the difference is very stark. You want to get a university education. So to break down dualism, this is a very long story, so maybe I'll just skip to the punchline. Companies hire non-regular workers because they want flexibility. Regular workers are hard to fire, so the economy goes into recession, you're stuck with workers you don't need. So what they do is hire non-regular so that they can lay them off during a recession. So, and they're also cheaper, lower wages. So the key is, the punchline at the very bottom here, is that we need to reduce employment protection for regular workers and increase social insurance coverage for non-regular workers. So the goal that we have is basically flexicurity. This is the Scandinavian model, that you don't protect jobs, you protect workers. So if the job disappears, the worker is protected through social welfare and unemployment insurance.
I mean, it's an interesting concept. I mean, even if you look at how the United States and Europe handled the pandemic differently, the European government, rather than take and have companies lay people off, subsidize part of the wage so that way they companies could maintain. So I mean, that could be another path. During recessions, government subsidies to maintain workers.
Exactly. All right. The problem is this requires higher taxes, and that's not an easy sell in the National Assembly in Korea. I'll skip. These are other aspects of their policy, but let me move on to this product market dualism, which is a large gap between productivity and wages between large firms and the SMEs. So if we look at the gap in SMEs in Korea, productivity is only about 32% that of large firms. And that's a huge gap. In some countries, we have a very small gap reflecting innovative SMEs, which is what Korea actually needs. So you look at the wage difference, if you're young, the gap isn't huge. So the bar represents what somebody in a company with 10 to 99 employees what they'll get compared to a micro firm with 1 to 9. So if you get into 10 to 99 employees, you get 20% more. But by the time you're 55 to 64, it's up to 45% more. If you look at difference with big companies, the triangle, the difference is 45% for young people. By the time you reach 55, 64, 140%. So if you get stuck in these small firms, your wage isn't going to really increase. And that reflects the fact many are non-regular workers, and they don't get seniority because they switch jobs too often. Or they work in the service sector, and the Korean service sector is low productivity. And 78% of SME employment is service sector. So if we want to talk about SME productivity, we need to talk about service sector productivity. It's the same, different side of the same coin, basically. And so if you get higher education, you avoid the small companies. Well, high school graduates, 55% end up in small firms, micro firms, 1 to 9. Only 22% of those with graduate degrees end up there. Those with graduate degrees, 40% end up in the large companies. So again, the education system is encouraging people to avoid stopping with high school and instead going for graduate school, so you can avoid that problem. So the SMEs have a vicious cycle. Low productivity, low wages. They can't hire high quality, well-skilled people for regular jobs. And then consequently, the share of non-regular workers, 48%, is very high. They're stuck in this cycle. And they can't afford to get the new technology that will allow productivity and wages to go up. So that's another issue we have to talk about, how to break down the SME problem.
Or even startups in South Korea is a whole other.
Right. The key solution really is the large companies in Korea aren't going to be hiring lots of people. The chaebol are basically internationalized, going overseas. They're not going to be hiring lots of people. The key is the innovative startups, the InnoBiz, the venture business. These are the main source of employment for young people. So we need entrepreneurship and dynamic SMEs to solve the problem of low productivity and also the problem of youth employment. So that's a very good way to stop. So I think I have, this is the SME, and this is the overall recommendation page. So let me stop there. We can follow up on the many questions that we have.
Yeah, and I'd like to open it up to the floor or online, but to give people a moment to formulate their questions. I think one of the things that stands out to me is that you have this issue we've talked about to where the labor force is highly educated, though there are questions about the quality of that education on the university level. But you talked about earlier that companies have this mismatch where they have a sort of a low-skilled older worker who's being replaced by a younger skilled high worker. Why is there not corporate reform going on that has sort of, because some of this makes sense. Korea has developed rapidly. The people who are near their retirement age grew up shortly after the Korean War, and they were not going to get the type of education people will today. So why are companies sort of not restructuring? Has the structure of labor in Korea itself changed? Setting aside whether people are getting the right degrees, but broader restructuring corporate-wise.
Right. Well, I guess for regular workers, the hard thing is you can't really dismiss them. The mandatory retirement age is usually 60, and so unless you can go through honorary retirement, which the government, the unions would like to outlaw, it's hard to get rid of older people as their productivity is lower than their wage. So the company's being rational. Once the productivity is lower than wage, you should try to get rid of those workers, but it's hard in practice because of employment protection. And you want to hire some of these young people with very good digital skills, but until you get rid of the older workers, it's hard to really hire those young people.
So before we go, I have one question I'd like to ask you, which is, so the union administration has been looking at labor market reform. They set together a committee that recently, about 2 or 3 days ago, put out their recommendations. These deal with things related to, for example, working hours and also to wage structure. What are your thoughts on those maybe in general, and then whether those reforms might help youth employment at all?
Right. I think one of the main reforms was to change the legal maximum working hours so that you don't have to do it by week or by month. You can do it over 3 months or a year. Because many small companies are complaining that with this limit of 52 hours per week, 40-hour regular work time, 12 hours overtime, they don't have enough labor inputs. I have my doubts about that. If you say, for example, you do it by month, and the limit is 52 hours per week by month. So that would mean, what, 208 hours per month would be the maximum. Well, if you do 40 hours the first few weeks, that gets you 120, and then you could do 88 the last week. And the problem is, one of the reasons for this is death by overwork. In Korea, as well as Japan, there's something called death by overwork, karoshi in Japanese, and karosa, I think, in Korean. And so if you make people work too much in 1 week, you put their health at risk. And the threshold that people talk about is 80 hours per week. At that point, you get into this risk to your health. So if companies are allowed to just put all the overtime into 1 or 2 weeks, then you create these health risks for workers. So I'm a bit skeptical about that kind of, in general I like flexibility, but I think that might put health at risk. The other proposal was performance-based wage. And that's one of the things we've always stressed at OECD. Not that we do it, but something we stress. And it's very complicated because the unions and the workers don't want to be judged by some anonymous group of people on how much productivity they've contributed. They want to know that next year my seniority goes up 1 year and my wage goes up this amount. And they know by the time they reach their 50s, when they have to pay for university tuition and weddings for their children, their wage will be high. They don't want the uncertainty that goes with this performance-based wage. For me, it's a solution to many problems. Women are more educated than men, but they make 34% less than men because they're being paid based on seniority, since many are non-regular. If they're paid based on their skills and contributions to productivity, their wages would be much higher and closer to men. So I think this is very important that we move towards performance-based wage, but I think at this point it'd be extremely difficult to try to introduce that. I know the government tried to introduce the peak wage system where at a certain point your wage levels off, and that caused nationwide strikes. So it's very sensitive when you start trying to adjust compensation schemes in Korea or any country for that matter.
Do you think it'll have any impact on youth employment, or do you think these are just broader market reforms that will really impact the labor market but not necessarily youth employment?
Right. In general, youth are underpaid because lifetime employment means you get underpaid when you're young, and then you stay with the company, so you get overpaid at the end. And so under this system, youth to be paid higher because they have these digital skills fresh out of school. So in the short run, they'd be better paid, but would they get more of them hired? That's not clear. But they would be paid more, and maybe that would give them the resources needed to buy the apartment, get married, and have kids, and start a normal life.
So it might not impact the youth employment issue, but it might help at least alleviate some of the other challenges on the societal demographic sides.
Right. In any case, we need to move to performance-based pay. It's
well, thank you, Randall. This has been sorry, we have one question from the floor.
For Korean young people, does earning a foreign university degree help or hurt their job prospects? And on the other hand, are highly educated Korean youth emigrating to find work?
So for our audience at home, does a foreign degree help or hurt job prospects, and are people emigrating to find work?
I think a foreign degree really helps with multinationals in Korea, but I'm not convinced it's any better than SNU or Sky University in Korea. I think at the graduate level, I think it's even more important because the graduate degrees in Korea aren't probably as well developed. But if you have a degree from a Sky University, Seoul National, Korea, or Yonsei, I think that is still the best university. In terms of emigration, we saw when Japan had a big labor shortage, they turned to Korea to bring in workers because, of course, they can pick up Japanese very quickly, and they have many similar cultural corporate practices. And so Koreans were used prior to the pandemic. They were an important source of labor for Japanese companies that could not find workers. In Japan, the job offer per applicant ratio was 1.6. So these severe labor shortages. So I think Korean workers with these high skill levels are very attractive. I know the government does try to assist youth who want to try overseas opportunities. And I think that's good. I know in the case of Ireland, we had this brain drain, but now they're all coming back. So I think in the case of Korea, going overseas to work for a while and then coming back with your experience would be good for the individuals as well as for the economy as a whole.
Just to follow up on that real quick, because we talked about this whole issue about being seen as irregular.
Right.
For, say, like a Korean, whether it's Japan, the United States, or somewhere else, if they go and they work abroad, say, for 5-10 years and come back to Korea, are they viewed different than an irregular worker as like potential, permanent workers, or do they kind of fall into that same irregular worker trap?
I think they would be hired initially on a fixed-term contract, and I think they would have to prove themselves that they can fit into the Korean corporate culture, which is a bit unique and different than many countries. So I think they have a worry that if you get used to working a European style or American style, you might not do what's necessary in Korea to be successful. So my view is that most of them end up with a fixed-term contract where they have to prove themselves as able to integrate into the Korean approach.
Well, again, thank you, Randall. This has been a really great discussion, and it's a very important issue. It's one that, as we mentioned, impacts not just the actual employment levels of the youth, but broader aspects of society. It's something that the Korean government's trying to work on, but clearly still has steps to take, and it's going to be a long-term issue. And I really thank you for taking the time to sort of talk through all of this. And again, if you haven't had a chance to read the chapter in the OECD survey, I would recommend you do. Also, we have one more event coming up next week on the 19th on Monday on Korea's ESG policy. For details of that, please go to our website, keia.org. Thank you.